Hey everyone, welcome back to Brainstorm. This is Python for NCEA. Now, in this video, we're going to take a look at exception handling. Now, what actually is exception handling? So, exception handling is when if we make an error in our program, or there's some kind of input that we don't want the user to input, we want to raise an error. Now, instead of the program just terminating or crashing, we can use exception handling to handle the error and print something which says like maybe be careful or try again. And so we can make programs that don't crash and that handle input that is invalid. Alright, so let's just jump into it. So the way Python handles exceptions is we use try except blocks. Now, a try block essentially contains all the code that we want to check for an error. Now, if an error is raised, or we get an error when that code is run, we use whatever's in the except block to handle the error, or essentially we write code in the except block that we want to be outputted if an error occurs. So let's do an example. So let's assume that we want to write a program which takes a number from the user. So let's write that program first. So we're going to take, and we're going to store it in a variable called user number. So user number is equal to the integer inputs, and we want to prompt the user to enter a number. So please enter a number. So what's going to happen is the user is going to enter a number. So if I save this and run it, if we enter the number 5, it looks like it runs just fine. But what happens if I enter a string? Well, you can see that we get an error. So it's saying that this is an invalid literal. We don't need to really understand what this is saying here. But what's more important is this thing here. We're getting a value error. Now, what a value error is it's essentially saying what we've put into this function, this integer function, is not an appropriate value. So the integer, so we cannot convert a string into an integer, so it's giving us a value error. The value that we've entered cannot be understood by the integer function. Okay, so the way that we use try except blocks is we're going to write try, put a semicolon, and you'll see that it goes orange for the try keyword. If we click enter, the text is going to be indented, and I'm just going to copy and paste our program into the try block there. Now, we also need to have an except block, and if we just write except, so except like this will work here. So this is a general case, which means for any error, let's output something here. Now, I think this is not generally recommended in practice because it's not very it's not very detailed, right? But we'll just do an example just for now, and then so essentially, because we know that we're going to produce a value error in this case, we should actually be putting except value error here, and you'll see that that keyword goes purple to say that's a valid error. So there's a whole bunch of different types of errors. I think we're going to look at value errors. There's also something called a type error, and there's something called an index error. There's a file not found error. I think those are probably the most common ones. So a value error is when we pass a value into a function which cannot be understood by the function. A type error occurs when we pass an object type which is not valid. So for example, the difference between type and value errors, the integer function can take strings. Okay, so it can take the string 5, but the integer function, I'm pretty sure it cannot take lists. I mean, let's try it. And 5, invalid syntax. Yeah, so the integer function cannot take the list 5, and we haven't learned lists yet, but this is a different data type. So it cannot process this list here and turn it into an integer because it doesn't make sense. So that's a type error because the integer function cannot take things or lists because it only takes strings, I'm pretty sure, or maybe even takes floats as well. Anyway, so we're going to accept a value error in this case. And what do we want to do? Well, anything inside the except block is going to run if we enter a string. So let's print out something like print error. You have entered a string. So if we run this now, and we enter string in here, it says error, you've entered a string and the program terminates. However, if I enter a number like 10, well, the program ends. If I enter a number like 10.5 or a float, well, as you can see, we're getting error, you have entered a string. Now, we don't necessarily have to use try except only when we're expecting an error. We can actually use try except if, for example, the user enters some invalid input, which can be accepted, but we don't want to accept that. So for example, if we could accept, like technically we can accept strings in some kind of function, but we don't want to accept strings, we only want to accept float values or something like that. So the way that we do that is, let's go try, and what example will we use in this case? Well, let's say we want to let the user enter a number, but that number must be divisible by 2. So essentially it must be an even number. If it's not an even number, we want to print out, hey, it's not even. So of course we could use an if statement for that, right? However, what if we wanted to first check that the user did enter a number and not in like some kind of string of text, right? So we're going to use the try except blocks here. So we're going to copy the same line from above. So try, we're going to please enter a number. So if that number, so let's go if the user number mod 2 is equal to 0, or is not equal to 0, then what do we want to do? We want to raise an exception, which essentially is going to print out an error. So we're going to say raise, and we have to raise something like an exception. So we could raise a value error, we could raise a type error, we could raise an index error. So I wonder what would happen if we type raise exception. I don't think that would work. So let's do raise a value error. So technically this isn't correct, but at this level we'll just raise a value error by default. We can also raise a type error, we can raise an index error, we can raise whatever error we want. So we're going to raise some kind of error here, and there shouldn't have been a colon there, so that's my mistake. So we've raised an error. So if the user number mod 2 is not equal to 0, this error message is going to be raised. Now let's accept this error. So we're going to say accept value error. And what we're going to do is we're going to type in print, sorry, this is not a valid number. Your number must be even. Okay, so let's save this and click F5. So please enter a number. If we enter the number 2, well, the program seems to write just fine. If we enter a string, hello, sorry, this is not a valid number and your number must be even. Now, if I enter 1, well, you can see that doesn't work again. And if I test out the number 500, I do not know what I've done there. So let's just hit 5 and try again. 500, and you can see it runs just fine. Let's next look at try, except, else, and finally blocks. So essentially try, so we know what try and except does. Try means run some code. Let's run an except block if there is some kind of error and we want to handle that. Now what the else block does says, let's run through the try block. If no error is raised, then we jump straight to the else block and run the code in there. If there's an error, then we run here. And what the finally block does is it says, regardless of if we run an except or an else statement, let's continue the code by the finally block. So let's do another example. This time, let's do a type error. So remember, a type error occurs when we enter some kind of value which is not accepted. So how will we do that? In fact, we haven't learned the tools in order to do that. Let's change it. Let's do an index error. So an index error occurs when we are out of the range of the index and we try to access an index which is not part of a string or even like a for loop. So let's make the string. So let's get the user to input a string, in fact. So user string is equal to input, please enter a string. Now we want to use try except, so let's write try there, and we need to indent this. Now we're going to do an index error here. So essentially we're going to purposely try and, okay, well actually, why don't we prompt the user to enter a number? So, and we're going to call it user index. So the number they're going to enter is the index we're trying to access. So user index is equal to integer input. Please enter a number, sure, let's enter a number. Now, we better run some if statements to check if the user did in fact enter a number here. So, if user index, well actually, if they don't enter a number, we will get a value error. So we will accept a value error here. And we will run some stuff down here as well. So what we'll say is if they did not enter an index here, we'll print, sorry, you did not enter a valid number. Now let's continue through our try block. So we've got the user string, we've got the user index. Now what we want to do is we want to access the user string at the given index, user index. And let's actually print that out to the idle shell. Okay, so if we print this out, what happens if the user index is greater than the user string? So like if our user string was hello, and we try to access the index 5, which is not actually an index in the string hello. Well, what we're going to get is what we call an index error. So let's accept an index error. So if we try to access an index which we don't already have, or which is not part of our string, we're going to print, sorry, you tried to access an index which is not a part of the string. And let's print out the string as well, which was format user string. Okay. Now we want to use try except else. So we've got two exceptions here, a value error and an index error. Now else, so what happens if there was no error? Well, if there was no error, we'll just print it was successful. And finally, so what this means is this will happen regardless of if we did an exception or else. Let's just print the user string out. So the user string was dot format user string. Okay, let's run this. Please enter a string. So let's just first check what happens. Actually, okay, let's just enter a string. We'll call it hello. We're going to enter a number. If we don't enter a valid number, it says, sorry, you did not enter a valid number. So it does the exception, and then it skips straight to the finally, which says the user string was hello. Now let's enter the string hello again, and let's enter a valid number. Let's enter the number 3 or 4 in this case. So it prints out the final index there. It doesn't raise an exception, so it runs the else statement, which says it was successful, and then it runs the finally, which is the user string was hello. Let's do hello again. Let's enter the number 100, and there is no index 100 in the string hello, so we should get, sorry, you tried to access an index which is not a part of the string hello, and the user string was hello. So this is how we use try, except, else, and finally blocks. But I think this is a little bit uncommon in NCEA practice. Okay, so next we're going to look at probably what's most useful for Python internals, which is using while true with try except handling. Oh, sorry guys, if you can hear any fireworks in the background, I don't know what Muppets are firing fireworks at 11:40 at night, but anyway. So essentially what this does is, so if we get an error when we ask for user input, the while true statement is going to keep looping. So we're going to handle the error obviously using except we're going to print an error message, and then it's going to continuously loop through until we enter what we actually want. So for example, if we want to write a program which takes a number from the user and they enter a string, well, we're going to print, hey, that's not an appropriate number, and then we're going to reprompt. So we're going to ask the user to enter a number again. We're going to continuously do that until they give us a number. So how do we do that? Well, we first write while true. Now, as you can see, this statement is always going to be true because while loops only execute while something is true, and this is always true. So how do we actually break out of the while loop? We're going to have to use a keyword called break, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. So the next thing we do is we write our try block, and we want to prompt the user for input. So user number is equal to int input, and what the input is please enter a number. Now, if the user does not enter a number, we're going to get a value error. So I could write except value error, actually it should be capital V, but I'm just going to use try except in this case. So this is a general case. So regardless of if it's a type error, index error, value error, file not found error, all of these errors, this except statement is always going to run if there is an error. So I'm just going to show you how this works, just in case you don't know if your error is going to be a value error or an index error. So this will be fine, usually for your internals, I'd imagine. So except, what do we want to do if we get an error? Well, what we want to do is we would want to print, sorry, that was an invalid number. Please try again. So note that I can't actually print this user number here. If I try and print the user number here down here, it's not going to work because this actually gave an error, so it didn't save the data. So I can't put this number into my print statement. So let's try out. Okay, let's see what happens if I do this. So if I run this and I enter a string, I type hi. Sorry, that was an invalid number. Please try again. Now I try and enter a number 5. Well, we didn't get that exception running, but it's still prompting me. Regardless of whatever I put in here, it's always going to prompt me for the number. So that's because of this while true here. So what we need to do is we need to say, if this works fine, we need to break out of the while true loop. So what we do is we write break. So now if I run it and I click into the number 5, well, the program ends. But if I enter S, it continuously runs, even if I enter a float or something, until I enter a number, which is 8. So that's how the while true loop works. And this is very useful. So if you keep prompting the user to enter, like, I don't know, like miles or like kilometers per hour. So if you're writing like a speed program or something and they enter a negative speed, then you're going to say, hey, that's not valid. Try again. So you can keep prompting using this technique here, which is quite useful. Okay, let's take a look at our application questions. So question 1, write a program which asks the user to enter an integer. If they do not enter an integer, handle the error appropriately. You should accept a value error. If the user has not made an error, you should print you entered the number X, where X is the number they entered. So we've actually already gone through this question in the examples, but I'll give you some time to figure this one out, and then I'll go over it. Okay, so hopefully that wasn't too hard. So we're going to write a program which asks the user to enter an integer. So we're going to have our try block. We're going to store in a variable called mynum is equal to integer input. And we're going to say, please enter an integer. Now, if they do not enter an integer, handle it appropriately. So accept the value error, and we're going to print careful, you didn't enter an integer. Now, what happens if they did enter an integer? Well, we can just continue the program in here, or we can actually continue the program afterwards. So the only thing is, if we continue the program afterwards, down here, it's going to print you entered the number and still whatever string they wrote, even if there was an error there. Okay, so that's why we usually want to put it inside the try block. So what we would do is we'll print you entered the number, whatever number they entered, dot format, and my num. So save that and click enter. Please enter an integer. We're going to enter the integer 37. You entered the number 37 and the program ends. So that looks like that works just fine. Now let's enter the letter T. Careful, you didn't enter an integer. So that's it for question 1. Let's move on to question 2, which looks like it's going to be a little bit more work. Let me just comment this out so it doesn't get in the way. Okay. Question 2. Write a program which continuously prompts the user to enter a positive floating point value. First, use the eval function, which converts whatever the user has input from a string into its correct type. If the user has entered 5.5, it will convert the input into a float. If the user has entered the string 5, it will convert the input into an integer. Now, the eval function returns a name error if it does not evaluate a number. Handle this error appropriately. Next, check if the user input is of the float type and is positive. If not, handle it appropriately. If the input is appropriate, we're going to print that float by referring to the suggested output for formatting, and actually we'll see that this exception handling holds for lists, tuples, and dictionaries, and so on and so forth later down the track. If we take a look at our user input, whenever we didn't enter a float, we got some different errors. So sorry, 5 is not a float. Please do not enter a string. If we enter a string, if we enter a negative float, you have not entered a positive float. And if we do enter a positive float, then we get you entered the floating point number 3.14. Have a go, and then we'll get into it. Okay, so first we're going to continuously prompt the user. So we need to have a while true statement. We're going to prompt them to enter a positive floating point number. So user num is equal to float input, and the input's going to be please enter a positive floating point value. Now first use the eval function, which converts whatever the user has input into its correct type. So user num is equal to eval, and we're just going to put the user number in there. So whatever the user number is here, we're going to get the type, or what the actual value should be here. So it's going to convert it from a string into its actual type. Okay, so that's what this is saying up here. Now, the eval function returns a name error if it does not evaluate a number. So I've actually made a mistake here. Well, not a mistake, but we need to have our try block here. So we're trying everything that's in here. Now, if we get a name error, so if this gives a name error, we want to handle that. So we're going to accept a name error. And what do we want to do? So essentially what this is saying is the user entered something like a string or a list or a tuple or a dictionary. These are all things we haven't learned yet. But they're essentially something that we could enter in here. So what happens if they do enter something like a string, for example? Well, what we want to print is, sorry, do not enter a string. So print sorry, and I do need to have my quotation marks there. Sorry, please do not enter a string. So that's that part done for whenever they enter something that's not a number. So what do we want to do next? Next, check if the user input is of the float type and is positive. So if not, handle this appropriately. So in this case, I guess we can probably continue it down in the try block here. I'm going to just use an else statement. So essentially, we're going to use an else statement to, so we're going to run this. If this runs fine, we're going to skip down to the else statement. If it doesn't run fine, we're going to just run the name error, and then we don't need to do any more work. Okay, so we've got our else statement now, and what we want to do is we want to run a bunch of if statements to check. 1, is it an integer? 2, is it positive or negative? and then if it's positive and if it's a float, then we want to print the value. If not, we want to handle those errors. So how are we going to do that? So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to go else if the user num, so whatever the user has entered, or the type of that, sorry, so if the type of user num is not a float. So we've already handled if it's a string, list, dictionary, a tuple, etc. What happens if the user num is an integer? So if the type of the user num is not equal to float, and we've got the semicolons, what do we want to do? Well, let's print, and the number, or the integer they've entered, is not a float dot format user num. Okay. Else, what do we want to do? So we've verified that it is a float. Now let's check if it's negative. So else if the user num is less than or equal to 0, what do we want to do? Well, we want to print you have not entered a positive float. And then else, so if it's a float and if it's positive, we just want to print the number. So print you have entered the floating point number, and then we'll put the floating point number that they've entered. So I better put a exclamation mark there, eh? And a full stop there. Okay, so now if I really wanted to, I could have multiple tries and accepts. So I could have started another try and accept and raise some value errors for here. I think it's not necessary since we can just print these if the user value is not what we want, and then we're going to have to loop. Sorry, we're going to have to loop back anyway because of this while true here, right? So we only want to break if this line here runs, okay? So if anything else happens, we want to continually run back and prompt the user. So the break statement should only happen in this else statement here. So let's save that and run it, okay? And we've got a few test cases to run through. So let's first test if it's an integer. So let's enter the integer 5. Okay, type error. Eval arg1 must be a string. So what's my user number taking? Right, sorry, I've put float in here, but actually the user value, the user can enter anything they want. Okay, so we don't want to just check if it's a float. We don't want to convert everything into a float because, for example, if we convert everything into a float, for example, actually I probably could convert everything into a float, but let's assume that we don't. Let's assume that we just take string input first. So please enter a positive floating point value number. Let's enter 5 now, and as you can see it says, sorry, 5 is not a float. So it runs here, it passes the accept, so it runs through the else, and it says, is it a float? It's not a float, so sorry, 5 is not a float. Next thing we want to do is, please enter a positive, so it's looped back to the while loop. The while loop is still running, so we've got the prompt happening again. Let's try now the string hello. So we've got the string hello. Sorry, please do not enter a string. So it looks like it's working good. Now let's enter a negative float. So let's enter negative 5.5. You have not entered a positive float. And finally, let's enter the number 3, or the float 3.14. You have entered the floating point number 3.14, and the program has terminated. Now guys, there's not just one way to do try except blocks, so it's all up to personal preference. There's multiple ways to code. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Cheers.